Hey, everyone. Welcome to Blind Injustice with Donya Lee Drinks. I'm Donya Lee, and this is my drink. Hello, lover. You might notice I'm not in my usual digs, so I'm not sure what the sound quality is going to be like either. I am not at home in my home office. I am in Norfolk, Virginia, doing a great pet sitting gig. But I didn't want to leave you hanging for 3 more weeks because I know it's been a while. So I'm recording from here. So bear with me with any background noise. We're kind of on a busy street. I'm pet sitting 5 whippets, so there might be some jingle in the background. Right now, they're all laying down very peacefully. So let's hope that continues. If you're new here, you would normally see a Taylor Swift paraphernalia wall behind me. But since I'm not at home, you can't see it. However, if you aren't new here, we know that respect must always be paid. So say it with me, all hail the Queen! And if you are new here, I'm just letting you know, you'll probably see her again at some point in this video. So welcome. My name is Donya, and I'm a registered nurse. I'm also a certified legal nurse consultant, which allows me to have a foot in both the medical and legal fields, which I love. One of my big passions is the Innocence Project and the work that they do. If you're not familiar with the Innocence Project, I encourage you to go back to my first video, which tells you a little bit about them, a little bit about me, why I'm doing this channel, along with some statistics about our judicial system that will keep you up at night. On this channel, we talk about the wrongfully imprisoned and how they were freed by DNA evidence. We'll cover cases where the exoneree was still in prison. We'll also cover cases of exonerees that were freed posthumously, which means that they had already been executed before their innocence was proven. And then we'll talk about some current cases that the Innocence Project is working on and how you can help. Last week, we talked about Kirk Bloodsworth, the first man to be freed in the United States based on DNA evidence. Today we're going to be talking about Victor Beau Burnett. It would take him nearly 3 decades to clear his name. Each week we have seen these men fight for themselves and sometimes for others, even after they've been out of prison. Beau is one of those men. Today's video won't be quite as long as my videos normally are. Why? Well, it's always really important for me to do a victim profile as well as the exoneree profile, because sometimes these cases of exonerees get so big in the news that that's all that's covered. And sometimes I feel like the victim of the crime gets a little lost. So I'd like to profile the victim of the crime as well. I was not able to do so in this case, and we're going to talk about why later, because I think it's a pretty controversial subject, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. So grab whatever you're drinking, and let's get started. Victor Burnett was born in 1959. He goes by the name Beau. I couldn't really find anything about his childhood or his upbringing. I do know that later there was some friction between he and his sister, and I'll tell you why I think that as we get further into the story. In 1979, Beau is 26 years old, and he lives with his grandmother. She is blind and arthritic, and he's her primary caregiver, especially in the evenings. But unfortunately, Beau has also a bit of a drinking problem. On August 3rd, 1979, Beau was at a local bar from about 10 p.m. till 2 a.m., and then he walked home to his grandmother's house. She would later testify that he got there just a little over 2 a.m. Unfortunately for Beau, because of said alcohol problem, he gets his nights mixed up, and he ended up giving the wrong story of his whereabouts for that evening. He would clear it up later in court, but the damage had kind of already been done by that point. That same night, about 2 blocks away, an 18-year-old woman has a fun night out with friends, and then she walks home to her apartment where she lives alone. It's extraordinarily hot that summer, so she leaves the front door open, her windows open, but locks the screen door. She wakes up at 3 a.m. with a man on top of her telling her to be still. She tells police later that she got a really good look at him by the moonlight coming in through the window. It takes her about 3 days to call the police, but she does, and she gives them the following description. She states he's white, about 5 feet 8 inches tall, and 160-ish pounds. She states he has long blonde hair and a mustache. Now, for reference, Bo has glasses and a beard, neither of which she mentioned in her description. She also tells police that the night after her attack, she was at her boyfriend's house, spending the night there. And at about 2 a.m, she heard noises in the street, and she went out to check it out, and she was sure she saw her attacker in the middle of the street. She called to him to see if it was his voice, but he fled the scene. After she files the police report, the police collect her sheets and send her to the hospital to gather any evidence they can find, even though it's been 3 days. The day after she filed the police report, she met with a detective, and they decided to meet in the detective's car outside of her apartment building. And she's giving him a description so they can do a composite sketch. While they are in the car together, Bo happens to be walking down the sidewalk towards them. When he notices them, he turns around and walks in the other direction, which looks really suspicious, right? And she noticed Bo walking toward the car and then turning around and walking away. And she got really upset and told the police officer that that was her rapist. So he sees that the guy's going in the other direction, and he calls for backup. And pretty soon a cop car pulls into the alley where Bo had been kind of sneaking away through this alley. The police pull up there, and they find him holding a beer. So later we would find out that the reason why Bo saw them and then turned tail and went the other direction really quickly is because he had an open container of beer, and he didn't want to get in trouble for that. But, we've seen this in these cases a lot. It's always just this perfect storm of incredibly unfortunate circumstances, and this is Bo's incredibly unfortunate circumstance. So they apprehend him and bring him to the police station. And of course, she IDs him as her attacker, even though he's wearing glasses and has a beard, which she never mentioned. She doesn't account for that, and of course the police never question it, because what do they want to do? What do we always say? Are they trying to catch a criminal? No, they're trying to close a case. So here we go again. They don't mention, hey lady, you didn't say anything about the beard or the glasses last time. And trust me, I am not victim blaming here. I am not. I just think a question or two about that would be prudent. But that's just me. So, of course, either the police don't pay attention to the discrepancy in her statement, or they just don't really care, because we've seen that happen before. And instead, they decide to count on an eyewitness account of a terrified rape victim who saw her attacker in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. by the moonlight coming in through a window. And that's enough for them to make a positive ID. At trial, the serologist Mary Jane Burnett would testify about the evidence in question. You're going to want to remember her name. We like her.
And we like you.
So she examines all the evidence. She's got the sheets, she's got some pubic hair, and then she's got the rape kit as well. And she testifies that one hair is consistent with Bo's, and the others are not consistent with him at all. And we know now that hair evidence really isn't evidence at all. But back then, they used like the hair shaft and how it looked, or the bands of color to be either consistent or inconsistent. And it's just kind of junk science, honestly. One of the unfortunate things, though, for as awesome as Mary Jane ends up being in this story, she does not explain these limitations of microscopy to the jury. What are the limitations of hair microscopy? I knew you'd ask.
Tell me.
Even today, there are no accepted standards for hair identification. Hair has no real microtype like fluids and blood have. Hair doesn't have that. It is living like tissue, but it ceases to live as soon as it's out of its root and out of its follicle. It's no longer living. So to be completely honest, there is no way to determine whether a hair came from this person, but not that person. Like I said, they call that junk science now, but even then they knew it had limitations. I'm so sorry about the traffic background noise. Trust me, it's driving me crazy too. Anyway, even then they knew it had its limitations, but they still counted on it way more than they do now. And despite the fact that there are 20 characteristics that hair has, there are still only 3 conclusions that you can come to: exclusion, no conclusion, or association. Association is the consistent with that she said. But if you don't go to all the trouble of clarifying that to a jury, and you're just a person coming off the street and you have a renowned scientist whose job it is to know these things, and they tell you that this hair is consistent with this person, well, that sounds like an ID to me, right? If you don't know any better. And she didn't make sure they knew any better, and that's really unfortunate for Bo. And this is why we call experts to the stand.
Okay, yeah, I'm no expert.
Because they're experts. They're supposed to break things down for us in a way that we can understand. And she doesn't do this, but we still like her. She also testifies that the victim's blood type was A, and that both Bo and the rapist were non-secretors, but she doesn't explain what this means. So again, it looks like a match when actually 20% of our entire population are non-secretors. So 20% of men in that area could be the perpetrator, not necessarily Bo. In case you missed the last episode,
shame on you!
A secretor is someone who secretes their blood type antigens into their bodily fluids. So you draw my blood and I'm A positive, but it's not just in my blood if I'm a secretor. It's also in my oral mucus, my nasal mucus. It's in people's vaginal secretions, in their semen. Anywhere there's mucus or fluid, secretors secrete their blood type into those bodily fluids. That's about 80% of our population that does that. 20% of the population are what we call non-secretors, and the only way you can find their blood type is actually from their blood. It doesn't present itself anywhere else in their body. And this takes place in Richmond, Virginia. So 20% of the male population of Richmond, Virginia is not just Bo Burnett, right? But she doesn't explain any of that. So guess what happens? Yep, he's found guilty and sent to prison. Even though Bo explained he was walking in the other direction because he had an open can of beer and didn't want to get into trouble. Even though his grandmother alibis him as being home just after 2 a.m., the jury convicts him of rape and burglary on October 23rd, 1979, and he is sentenced to 25 years in prison. And like all the other cases we've discussed so far, he files appeals, which are denied. Are appeals ever granted? Jeez, it just seems like hoops that you have to jump through, but you never actually win an appeal. That's what it feels like from all these cases we've done. I'm sure that's not the case, but I'm sure starting to feel like that's the case. He serves 7 years before he's paroled in 1987. State forensic lab in Virginia and repeatedly asks for the evidence in his case. And he is repeatedly told that once you're found guilty, all case evidence is destroyed. Where have we heard that before?
I think I've seen this film before, and I didn't like the ending.
And poor Bo, because of his conviction, he can't find any employment either. So he teaches himself carpentry and kind of becomes a handyman, but it's still really hard for him to get work because even though he's got these new skills, people know who he is. And of course, because he was found guilty, they think he is guilty. So he is barely getting by at this point. His parole finally gets discharged in 1993. And now we're going to fast forward to the year 2005. For 12 years, Bo has been begging for this evidence, and for 12 years, they've been repeatedly telling him that the evidence was destroyed. He's been trying every way he can think of to get his name cleared, But without that forensic evidence, it's all but impossible.
But I'm innocent.
But then he reads an article in the newspaper about these two men that were exonerated by DNA evidence. It's two men that we haven't covered yet, so it's not familiar cases to either you or I at this point. And as he's reading this article, guess who their lab serologist was? You guessed it. You guys are so smart. The serologist for these exonerees was Mary Jane Burnett. So it turns out the forensic lab wasn't lying after all. Back in the 1970s, if somebody was convicted, their evidence was destroyed, which I can't tell you how bad of an idea that is. We had to have been smarter than that in the 70s. Even though DNA wasn't a thing yet, why wouldn't you keep evidence samples? I mean, science is evolving all the time. We knew that in the 70s. It's not brand new information. So the forensic lab really thought the evidence was destroyed, and they weren't out of line in thinking that. But Mary Jane Burnett, she was ahead of her time. She always kept samples in her own personal files of the cases that she worked on, and she trained all her lab technicians to do the same. Now, this was actually against the law. She was a woman of science, and she knew there were things that she didn't know yet and that we didn't know yet, and she knew it would be good practice to keep those samples, because you just never know, right? So she kept samples for every case that she worked on. And Bo is really excited because this means that she probably stored his evidence in a file as well. It's a wonderful thing that she did this, and you'll know why here in a second. So hang on to your seats. By 2019, 13 wrongfully convicted men were exonerated solely based on the evidence that Mary Jane Burnett kept that the subsequent state had destroyed. 13. Unfortunately, Mary Jane had passed away, and so she never got to understand the magnitude of her work and what she did by simply keeping these samples. And it's so strange that her files were kept meticulously intact even after her death. Everybody kept up her files for her, but nobody had any idea there was actual physical evidence within these files. But once the exonerees start stacking up, they start pulling her files purposely. I was really bummed that I couldn't find a more recent number than 2019. I mean, I know that was only a few years ago, but my guess is that number is way higher than 13 now. So you go, Mary Jane! So Bo reads this article, and like I said, he's really excited. He thinks maybe she kept his evidence as well. So he calls the forensic state lab, and they are so tired of hearing from Bo at this point. But he explains to them about the article and about Mary Jane and asks them to specifically go and look inside her files, not the police files, but her files. And guess what they find? They find evidence. But this next part stymies me. They release that evidence to the case's prosecutors. But in 2006, the original prosecutors decide to do the right thing, and they have the DNA tested, and it excludes Bo. Okay, now this next part, you know there's always some part of these cases that just really makes your blood boil, right? So this is going to be that part. 2007, Bo files a writ of innocence petition to get his name cleared, and it's denied. And wait till you find out why. In order to submit a writ for innocence, you have to be in prison.
What the hell?
Bo's not in jail anymore. So he can't get his writ of innocence because he's not in prison anymore. It has nothing to do with his actual innocence. It's all about the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law. And how often do we see that in these cases? So they deny his petition because he's not in prison when he wrote it. I'd be like, sons of bitches, lock me up. I'll write it from jail. For the love of Pete. So because Bo is no longer in jail, he can't get factual innocence. What is wrong with our justice system? So instead, he has to write the governor for a pardon. And if you know anything about pardons, they're extremely hard to get. It's really hard to get a stay of execution pardon. It's hard to get innocence pardons. They're really difficult to get. But Bo gets his. In 2009, Governor Tim Kaine grants his pardon. Not just a pardon, an absolute pardon. So this, like I said, was in 2009. Bo was paroled in 1987. I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I could keep that fight up for 30 years and some change. I mean, he was already out. The parole was dismissed. He was just kind of living his life. But it was this important to him, and it took him over 30 years. He was Mary Jane's 6th exoneree. I really hope that they are actively looking into all her files, because God only knows how many more innocent men are out there in prison. Bo spoke at a Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project conference, and he was very tearful when he talked about how he wished his dad was still alive when he got his pardon, because his dad always really believed in him. And that's when he mentions that his whole family stood behind him except his sister. He made a point of kind of calling her out. So I don't know if his sister assumed he was guilty. It just seems like there's some contention there. And I don't blame him at all. Don't blame him one bit. He has not been as gracious as a lot of these men we've seen are. You can tell he's still really angry and bitter about all of it. And like I said, I don't blame him a single bit. As of 2019, the real perpetrator hadn't been found. I couldn't find anything past that. So I actually just wrote the State of Virginia Forensic Lab and asked if the evidence in the case had been run against CODIS, and was there just no match, or if it had not been run against CODIS, and if that was the case, then why? And I really never expected to hear back from anybody, but I did. But it's, the answer I expected. They said it's because it's an ongoing investigation, it's not subject to the Freedom of Information Act, and they don't have to give me anything if they don't want to, and they are electing to not want to. So I don't have any more information on that. However, I think if they had found the real person, it would be all over the news, because I am telling you, this victim is absolutely 100% sure it's Bo. And she's clearly still very traumatized by what happened to her, and who wouldn't be. And now she's got potentially an innocent man who went to prison and had to spend 30 years to clear his name hanging over her head. So I'm not sure if she really believes it, or if she's just kind of digging her heels in because the alternative is just too much to bear up under. I mean, how do you live with yourself for sending the wrong person to prison? Everybody makes mistakes, and I get that, but that would be really hard to live with. This is why we don't count on what? Eyewitness testimony. How many times have we seen in these cases where eyewitness testimony puts the wrong person away? We've got to stop doing that. She was traumatized. It was the middle of the night. It was moonlight. I am not blaming her. I am not victim blaming. I'm sure she really believed it to be him. But DNA doesn't lie. But her take on the whole thing was, I saw what I saw, and labs make mistakes all the time. And she was really upset that people were bringing it back up, of course, once he got his pardon. It just kept coming up over and over again because he was constantly trying to clear his name, and then the pardon, and then all this evidence of Mary Jane's. And, it's just in her face all the time. She has no real way to move on. And that's basically what she said. She said, I saw what I saw. Labs make mistakes all the time. What's the good of bringing this back up? Am I supposed to say, oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, let the guy go? She said, I don't care what happens to this man. It's been 30 years, and I just don't want it brought up anymore. And I get that. I do. A lot of times when something happens to you, you can just put it behind you and move on. But in a lot of these cases, new evidence comes up, things happen, and it's just like they don't ever have the ability to move on. So yeah, lab tests are wrong all the time. But DNA is never wrong. So I tried to find some information on our victim, and boy, did that lead me down a rabbit hole. I guess I'd never paid much attention to this, but think about it because it's true. If somebody's murdered, you know their name. If somebody's beaten up, kidnapped, whatever, you know their name. They're robbed, you know their name. But with cases of sexual assault, you don't know their name. And I had never, like I said, I'd never thought about it before. I knew minors were protected. And it's not even really a law except in 2 states. But it's more like this unwritten code of ethics things with reporters that you're not supposed to reveal their name. And there's a ton of controversy about this. Now, some people say because of all the victim blaming and shaming that goes on, we need to protect these women. But there's another side that says, until we start publishing their names, we're never going to be able to get rid of the shame and the stigma of rape or sexual assault, because hiding their identity kind of reinforces that sense of shame. I'm not really sure how I feel about that on either side because I see both sides. I mean, I would have liked to have known her name just to get some background information on her, like how old she was, well, she was 18, what she was doing, like was she a college student, what was her upbringing like, what were her and her friends doing that night, just to get an idea of who she is as a person. Because like I said, this crime was not really about Bo originally. This crime is about this 18-year-old who was sexually assaulted in the middle of the night, and that gets lost. And now if I don't even have her name, we can't even really, it's hard to think of her as even a human being because we know nothing about her. So I was just trying to get a little bit more visibility about who she was. Even though I don't know how I feel about it, here's the deal. This is not a fair fight. The victim's identity is always protected. But the assailant, his identity is never protected. Even from the arrest, the questioning, the trial, you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, right? Those names are never protected. So you've got a victim who gets to keep their identity quiet. And you've got an accused assailant, only accused assailant, whose name is everywhere. Newspapers, social media, television, you name it. Their name is everywhere. How fair is that? Remember the last episode with Kirk Bloodsworth? His name and picture were everywhere from the time he was arrested. And how many IDs came after he was on TV? There was like 5 or 6. And he wasn't guilty. So what do you think? Do you think adult victims of sexual assault should have their name published just like victims of any other crime? Or do you think they deserve special protection, and why do you feel that way? What about the accused? Do you think it's fair that the victim is protected, but the accused name is not protected even before they're found either innocent or guilty? Because let me tell you something. Even those who are found innocent, there are always people that are going to believe that they are secretly guilty. And their lives are ruined in some way, just the same. Let me know your thoughts in the comments box below. I always ask you to do that, and you guys never do. But I'd really like to know how you feel about this one, because I think it's a riveting subject and one that needs to be spoken about. Innocent until proven guilty? I don't think so. That's it for today, kids. Again, if you're interested in doing your part, consider having your DNA taken by a service such as 23andMe and submitting it to GEDmatch. GEDmatch is a service that builds family trees around people's DNA that are submitted to them. That's the only thing they use it for. They don't give or sell your DNA to anyone else. It's just to help put ancestry trees together in case they get partial DNA matches or like generations removed DNA matches, it helps them be able to track closer to the person they're trying to get to. And like I always say, do I want to be related to a criminal? No. But if I am, I would like to do my part in making that criminal responsible for their criminal behavior. What do I always say? Those with nothing to hide, hide nothing. And also, as always, I encourage you to go to the innocenceproject.org and take a look around. And please, I'm a proud donator to the Innocence Project. And I hope once you get on their site and take a look around, you'll feel compelled to do the same. They count on these donations in order to run the DNA tests that are necessary for the exonerations. And they've always got like between 4,000 and 6,000 cases that they're working on that they just can't get to. Because of course, like the death row ones are at the top of the list. And then whatever resources are left go to those in prison but not facing the death penalty. And they need all the help that they can get. So I hope you'll consider donating to them as well. We'll see you next week. Until next time, be kind to each other, stay in your lane, and don't be a Karen. Love you. Bye.